Welcome back to Giant Monster Games. I'm Adrian, and today we are doing a deck called Rakdos Burning Hands, as you probably saw in the title. Now, this deck is more of a rogue build than it is an actual budget deck, and instead of doing an upgrade version at the end of the video, I'm actually going to do a budget version at the end of the video, so you can build this deck for a little bit less. But before we actually get into the video, don't forget to smash the like button, subscribe to Giant Monster Games if you like this content, and vote for the next video. It could be a budget deck or a rogue deck. Let's get into it, starting with why this deck is called Rakdos Burning Hands. First of all, Rakdos just means it is a black and red deck. The first card of interest is Rune Flare Trap. Now, we're running 4 copies of this, and as you've probably seen by now, the reason why this deck is called Burning Hands is because we are doing damage to our opponent by the number of cards in their hands. At least this is what this card is doing, and then we have a bunch of other cards that facilitate this. So we're never actually playing this card for its mana cost, actually. It has a trap cost, which is a really neat thing that only exists on a few cards, that whenever our opponent draws 3 cards in the same turn, so it could be on our turn or on their turn, we can cast it for 1 red mana. Generally, we're firing this thing off for like 5 to 10 damage for 1 red mana, which is really efficient for us. We also have the next card, which is Molten Psyche. We're running 3 copies of this. Now, this is a little bit different than Rune Flare Trap, because Rune Flare Trap just deals damage equal to the number of cards in their hand, where Molten Psyche's main ability is each player shuffles their hand into their library and then draws that many cards. This card also has Metalcraft, which means if we control 3 or more artifacts when we cast it, it deals damage to our opponent equal to the number of cards they've drawn this turn. So they just shuffled their entire hand and drew a whole new hand. That's a lot of extra damage. We've also just cycled our hand and made our opponent draw usually more than 3 cards. So if we draw a Rune Flare Trap, we can just cast that for 1 red mana, doing a ton of damage in 1 turn. It's obviously not super consistent, but it can surprise win us the game. Carrying on, we have 4 copies of Toil and Trouble. Now, this is a special card because it's actually 2 different cards, which we can cast either half of these cards, or we can cast them together at the same time. So Toil can be used to draw us cards if we're in a bad position, or more commonly, we can use it to facilitate Rune Flare Trap on our turn. And then we can also cast Trouble, which does damage equal to the number of cards in our opponent's hand, so we can usually cast this to do a good 5 to 7 damage to our opponent. Obviously, it's not the most efficient damage spell, but it can do a lot of damage in 1 turn, which is what we're aiming for. Now let's take a look at the artifacts we're using to fill up our hand and our opponent's hand. We have 4 copies of Howling Mine and 4 copies of Temple Bell. Now, Howling Mine just draws each player an extra card at the beginning of their upkeep. Secondly, we have Temple Bell, which is really good because we tap to make each player draw a card, which means we can generally be doing it at the end of our opponent's turn, so they're not going to get those extra cards right away. Or when we're about to cast one of our big spells that rely on the size of our opponent's hand, we can use this to just fill up their hand. It's also really good at getting Rune Flare Trap to trigger, because if we have a Howling Mine in play, our opponent's going to draw 2 cards at the beginning of their upkeep, and then during their draw step, we can actually tap this, make them draw their 3rd card, and then fire off a Rune Trap, which means it's going to be a minimum of 3 damage for Rune Flare Trap, which is pretty rad if you ask me. Now, I need to point out that these are our ideal turn 2 and turn 3 plays, because we need to get this up and running so we can fill up our opponent's hand and do lethal damage. I know there's some other cards you're going to see that you're like, oh, I really want to play that, and unless you're playing against a deck where you need to have them in play, you really need to be playing these first, even if it means you're going to take some damage from your opponent. Let's move on to our creature package, starting out with Master of Feast. We are running 4 copies of this guy, and he is awesome because he is a 5/5 flyer for 3 mana, and he facilitates our plan because at the beginning of our upkeep, our opponent draws a card, which means their hand is going to fill up, and we get a 5/5 flyer. This guy can also be a pretty ideal turn 3 play because it does facilitate our plan, and it gives us a huge blocker that our opponent just generally can't deal with. Next, we have a single copy of Adamaro, First to Desire, because sometimes he is really good, and sometimes he is really bad. Also, he's a legendary creature, so we're never going to be able to get 2 of them on the table, so we're just going to run 1 of him. His power and toughness are equal to the number of cards in our opponent's hand, so if we swing in on our turn, we can pump him up with Master of Feasts or Temple Bell, or if we leave him to block, our opponent has to play some cards usually to try and get him small enough so that they won't just immediately be killed by whatever he blocks. Next, we have Eidolon of the Great Revel. We're running 2 copies of this card, and it is really funny in this deck because our opponents are going to be getting a ton of cards, meaning they want to play a ton of cards, but whenever they play a card with converted mana cost 3 or less, they're going to take 2 damage, which means them trying to dump their hands, so we're not going to do a ton of damage to them with our other spells, means they're going to take more damage. Don't be surprised if this guy gets removed from the table almost as soon as you play him, because he kind of becomes a lightning rod. And the last creature we have is Hangerback Walker Walker. We have 4 copies of this guy because he is so fantastic. For one, he helps us trigger Molten Psyche, so that card is going to become more viable. And 2, when he dies, he creates a whole bunch of 1/1 tokens, which means we can block even easier, allowing us to defend against aggro strategies. Now we have some removal spells. Let's quickly talk about those. First, we have Pyroplasm. We're running 2 copies of this, and a single copy of Anger of the Gods, because we want to kill a lot of stuff, not just one thing at a time. Pyroplasm does that quite well against most decks, and Anger of the Gods obviously just does it better. Be advised though, Anger of the Gods exiles stuff when it kills it, so if you use this, it may actually kill your Hangerback Walker and not get you tokens, but it is generally better than Pyroplasm, even though it costs a little bit more. And the last card is Lightning Bolt. We're running 4 copies of this. This is no surprise. We're running a red deck, may as well run 4 copies of Lightning Bolt because it is perfect spot removal, and it can also go to your opponent's face, which can close out the game. Now let's talk about lands. This is going to be quite a bit more intensive because this is actually a rogue deck build, not a budget deck build. First of all, we have Blood Crypt and Bloodstained Mire. These cards are obviously modern staples because we can use Bloodstained Mire to go and fetch a Blood Crypt and generally get both red and black mana on turn 1 quite consistently. As you can guess, we're going to be running 4 copies of both these cards. Moving on, we have Dragon Skull Summit. We're running 4 copies of this, and because we're running Blood Crypts in this deck, it's really easy for this to enter the battlefield untapped. Carrying on, we have 2 copies of Ghost Quarter. This is giving us some main board defense against Tron, Infect, a bunch of other decks. Next, we have a single copy of Darksteel Citadel. This is helping us trigger Molten Psyche. Obviously, we don't want a ton of generic mana because we actually have a bunch of 2 red or 2 black spells we need to cast, so we can't really dilute our mana pool too much. And lastly, we have basic lands, which is just going to be 4 mountains and 4 swamps. Let's finish up the deck by talking about our sideboard. First off, we have 2 copies of Crumble to Dust. We're using this against Tron, against Infect, Abzan, where we actually need to knock them down a couple pegs so they don't get the advantage on us. 2 copies of Doomblade, again, just spot removal if we need it. 2 copies of Guttural Response. This is going up against any blue deck where they're going to be countering our big spells. We counter their counters, really, is what we're doing with it. Next, we have 3 copies of Rakdos Charm, and this card is doing triple duty in this deck. 1, it allows us to exile someone's graveyard, so dealing with Tron, dealing with Grixis. It also destroys artifacts, which means we can do it with Affinity or a variety of other decks that need artifacts. And lastly, it can make each creature deal 1 damage to its controller, which means if we're going against a strategy that's going wide, such as tokens or elves, we can actually use this to fire off like 7 or 8 damage in one go. So it actually is doing a lot of really good stuff. Then we have Ratchet Bomb, which is allowing us to deal with, again, tokens. It allows us to deal with a lot of stuff. Highly recommended in the deck. 2 copies of Shrapnel Blast. This is just giving us some extra damage if we're going up against a bunch of control decks or potentially even some combo decks where we just need to get in extra damage and we don't have the time to set up the game plan we need. We can actually use this to just fire off some damage really quick. And lastly, we have Silent Arbiter, which has also helped to deal with creature strategies where we can just control the flow of creatures coming at us and generally use our Master of the Feasts to just pound whatever comes in our way into the ground. That's the general plan. And that makes up the entire sideboard. But before we end the video, let's talk about some budget options. The first thing we have, and probably the most relevant, is some land replacements. We have Forbidden Ruins and Smoldering Marsh. Obviously, these can be mixed and matched to replace our Blood Crypt and our Bloodstained Mire. They're not perfect fixes, but they are pretty good. Next, we can replace Anger of the Gods with another Pyroplasm. It's a pretty simple fix. As far as Eidolon of the Great Revel is concerned, we can actually replace it with either Dragon Master Outpost, which will give us some creature advantage late game, or Reckless Fireweaver, which will just give us some extra damage to our opponent as we play artifacts, which is another option. They don't replace Eidolon completely because there's nothing that does the same effect that's budget, but they are interesting and relatively good options. Next, Lightning Bolt has been crawling up in price just steadily, and it probably will continue to keep climbing, so you could always replace Lightning Bolt with Shock. It's not as effective, but it is a 1-drop damage spell, which you can use for spot removal. And lastly, there's an okay replacement for Hangerback Walker, and that is Mere Sire. It doesn't do as good a job as Hangerback Walker, but it does create a token when it dies, so it has a similar effect. And that is the entire deck tech. If you enjoyed this video, consider sharing it, pound the like button, and subscribe to Giant Monster Games. I'm Adrian, and until next time, don't forget to game like a giant monster!